Welcome to Becoming Parents podcast. I'm your host, Jen Taylor Campbell. I'm a birth and bereavement doula, as well as an adoption and surrogacy doula. Doula means woman who serves. And although I love happy births, adoptions, and surrogacy, the pro bono part of my business is in bereavement. I'm here to help you. I'm also mom of 18, yes, 18 children, with over 30 years experience in the trenches as a mom myself. We have a huge blended family, and I've also experienced the loss of our adult son. Remember, give a shout out to those brave enough to share their stories on how they have become parents. Let's dive in. Welcome to Becoming Parents. I'm Jennifer Campbell, your host, and today I'm here with Dr. Nathan Riley. How are you, Nathan?
I am so great. I just told you that I'm the hero of the morning because I found the Barbie shoe that was missing in the yard. And that feels like a tremendous accomplishment with how high our grass is right now. It's due for a cut and we lost a Barbie shoe, but
I mean,
here we are.
I love the crazy randomness of like, what? why is my morning like this? It's great. I love your uterus. I don't say that to men very often, but
Thank you. It's not something I'll ever be able to be told by like an OB-GYN or anything. So I've got my uterus back here and mine's a little flashier than most uteruses that I've seen in the past. So
like they took mine out. I don't even have one. You have more of a uterus than
I think
do
yours
right
is
now.
actually, I lit yours up. I animated yours back here. Yeah. There's
Well,
a little
thanks.
sliver of vagina there too.
It's been a really long time. I love when you say little sliver and vagina in the same sentence. We all need to hear that more, right?
Yeah. I think we might have our podcast episode title right there. A little sliver of vagina with Dr. Nathan Riley.
I'm going to have to put that in there. I want to start because, I only have bullet points, which I love. And I want to talk about you being an OB-GYN and then going through becoming a parent. I feel like I had this conversation with a pediatrician recently, and she said, my whole practice changed because before I had kids, I was like, why are
Oh, yeah.
parents asking me all these lists of questions like I'm the be all end all? And then she had a child and she was like, holy crap, now I know why parents are asking, and it changed her trajectory. Your story is bigger than that. So can you take me through that transition of being an OB-GYN, having a child, and your like, holy crap moment?
Yeah, well, let me just say that when we go to our medical training, we want to be the best doctor that we possibly can. What draws us into, my debt is about $500,000. I didn't go through all of the school and invest my entire, probably forever life savings. Instead of it going into the bank to make, interest and all that, it's going towards the government's, the payback program. I mean, to go into this type of field, you have to really, really, really be passionate about something. And for me, I was really, really passionate about getting people healthier, even reversing disease, like this diabetes, obesity, hypertension thing, the metabolic syndrome, as we call it. I was like, man, it's amazing that as much money as we have in our country, there are so many people just being kind of left behind to their own devices with really inadequate food supply and multiple jobs, so they don't have time to exercise. Their sleep is atrocious. Like, I was thinking maybe we could change things from a public policy level to really kind of dial in what medicine was. And then I went through med school, and it's so much work. And then residency, it's so much work that many of us kind of lose sight of what really compelled us to make such sacrifices. And when I saw my first birth, which was probably in health class, but I was so like, it was so shocking that many of us were like, oh, and then in med school, you go to at least one birth. I mean, that's kind of like a rite of passage in your third or fourth year. And I saw a birth and I was like, wow, like this is so much more than medicine. Like there's something really, really palpable in this room. But the problem was that when I went into residency, I found that it was like very, very little time with the people that I was there that I made such sacrifices to care for. And I found that birth was being reduced to sort of a medical procedure, and pregnancy was seen as a disease process. And I was like, there's nothing sick about this person having a baby. If anything, they're like as vital as anybody I've ever seen. So it was like, oh, this is the healthy young population, both the moms who are going to give birth or coming in for gynecologic issues and their male partners or their female partners, doesn't really matter. This is a youngish population. And, of course, you take care of women all the way through their life. But I was so compelled by this birth thing. And as you go through those 100-hour work weeks, you start to realize that there's got to be a way to do this. And if you don't do it that way, then you're a flunky. And you're kind of taught to not really show
Yeah.
any weakness. You're taught to not really ever say, I don't know, or I made a mistake. And I just found the whole thing to be sort of disillusionary for me. And fast forward, I mean, of course, I'm with my high school sweetheart. That's the woman I married and have
Yes.
kids with.
Yes.
And I was thinking, this is this incredible person. I knew her when she was a little girl, and I'm thinking about her going through this system. And I just can't imagine talking to somebody like that, or treating somebody like that, or sticking my hand inside of her without asking permission. It goes back to basic consensual stuff. And of course, I was spending so much time in the operating room. 70% of our training is in surgery. And I wasn't really interested in being a surgeon. Like, I wanted to at first, like it sounded cool. And then you do it a couple times and you're like, this is really neat. I'm getting good at this. And then you do it like 500 times, like a C-section. And of course, not even mentioning all the other gynecologic surgery. And you're like, this blows. This isn't what I signed up for. So I found I wasn't having enough time to really implement any sort of lifestyle modification. I wasn't getting any sleep myself. I wasn't being incentivized to care for myself. I was told my family comes second. And now I'm spending all day in the operating room when I want to really just sit with people and be with them through this magical thing, which I still and never will figure out. But then using my wife as kind of my guidepost, who she really has been my anchor my whole life, it was like, what would I want if I was like, if we were going to have a baby? And that really starts then you start to dream up what your ideal practice in life would look like. And I had to
Mm-hmm.
craft that for myself. So I kind of just dipped out of the system and had to find my own way. But now I do home birth. I do a lot of really uproot cause of issues, functional medicine. I do a lot of that. And I still keep the allopathic toolkit there, but I very rarely have to dip into that because there's far more abundant modalities when we just look at how we live our lives, especially as parents now. Taking care of ourselves is really our medicine. We don't even use pharmaceuticals. And that's because we like to think that we're doing our very best with our limited resources in order to take care of ourselves. So I can do that now on a daily basis with women remotely in their home, in home births.
Mm.
And that's really what I think compelled me to go into this in the first place. So I just had to kind of reverse engineer it and figure out how to do that. But that's where I am now.
I love that. I mean, functional medicine, I think if people don't know what that is, that kind of bridge between allopathic and more holistic, it can be. And like I've had a naturopathic physician most of my life. She
Yeah.
wasn't the one that could do my hysterectomy when it was an emergency, but she did help me on the front end and the back end of that to help me heal through it and work through it. And so I definitely think there's a balance. And as a doula who is predominantly now in the hospital with Medicaid clients, so I switched my own practice because I wanted to work with the most underserved
Yeah.
group of women that are in the highest risk category. Why is that? Why? Because they're the lowest income and
Right.
education, that they're
Right.
also the highest risk. Because that seems like isn't that a fluke? Why is that?
Yeah.
In a society where it should be under 10% of C-sections and we're at over 30%, I mean,
Yeah.
definitely it's hard to sometimes bridge those gaps. So I'm so grateful.
Sure.
Now, you said you did things virtually, but where are you actually located? Where's your practice located?
I live in Kentucky, in Louisville,
Okay.
Kentucky. That's where my
Okay.
wife and I live. And so I attend home births within the region. I'm
Right.
in some regards, I guess you could say fortunate that several of the states, including my own, are just not very friendly to out of hospital birth.
Yeah.
On the downside, though, is that I don't actually recommend people come to me for home birth. I suggest people find a midwife. And the reason for that is traditionally midwives have really, really honed in their skills on caring for, let's say, 85% plus of women who are pregnant. And that's like the lower risk. The likelihood of something bad happening is extremely low. But if you're especially high risk, there's good reason to go to the hospital. I
Yep.
don't want to dissuade people completely. But on the other hand, many women, especially women of color, I mean, you brought up the socioeconomic disparities in
Yes.
the
Yep.
country. It's impossible to talk about that without acknowledging that women of color are generally mistreated in hospitals.
Mhm.
They're generally they're not necessarily low income, but they're coming from communities whereby they probably didn't have 3 or 4 generations of wealth preceding them. There's just quite a bit of issues there, and we have a lot of women of color in the Midwest here. So on one hand, it's there's a lot of midwives that are cropping up and doing that work. and taking in all comers, you know, and the downside though, of course, is that a lot of midwives still have to practice sort of out of pocket. And I also practice out of pocket. Many of us use a sliding scale, and I would never say, no, I can't take care of you if you can't pay me anything. But the reality is that like this is a really, really expensive process for anybody, whether you're in the hospital and you're at home. And for women of color, women who are underserved, who don't have the luxury of going to Whole Foods and getting the best beef and everything else, we've got a pickle there, because we also know that eating that way is also what helps prevent you from needing the unnecessary surgeries and everything else. So a part of what I do here in Kentucky is try to connect people with midwives with whom I collaborate.
Yeah.
And then also just to provide them as much care as I can on the side, so that they don't end up in a hospital where maybe they are going to maybe experience a mistreatment or an unnecessary induction or C-section or whatever else. So it's a constant balancing act for me, where I want people to have out of hospital birth, but it's also very expensive to do that. So bridging the gap is still something that if you ever figure out how to do that, let me know.
Oh,
But
no, I mean, absolutely not. Obviously I'm working with a demographic. Medicaid doesn't cover home birth. And so
yeah,
if they can't pay for it out of pocket, then they're in the hospital. So, I
right.
mean, I had to look at it and one, be comfortable in the hospital, which is tough for, doulas, midwives. It's tough for us to feel comfortable
Yeah,
there. I'm comfortable there, but also how can I make this the absolute best experience for this woman
right.
in the
All
in
things
this
considered.
situations, right?
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
can't change this situation, but within that, I can make it the best experience, and
totally.
there is no right way or one thing or do there is nothing, there's none of that. It's a balancing act the whole time. I love that balancing act because I feel like it's the only way that they can potentially get that
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
situation where financially they cannot advocate and pay for themselves. I was lucky.
yeah.
I had one hospital birth that saved my daughter. I had an emergency hysterectomy that saved me years later.
Wow.
So
Yeah,
I've had positive experiences that were very traumatic and challenging, but were positive and necessary, and 3 home births that I could pay for and do on my own.
yeah.
And it's not everybody can do that, and I understand that. It's so hard. Um,
Let me also like add to that to piggyback. So I used to do a lot
sure.
of work in East Africa where
Mhm.
HIV/AIDS was like rampant. You know, everybody was dying of just a crippled immune system. Essentially, is what they
Yes.
died from. And on the one hand, people say, hey, we can't just focus on giving medications and accommodating this problem. And on the other hand, you need systemic change in order to make sure that people are not being ravaged by an otherwise kind of pesky virus. You know, I mean, people in underserved communities tend to suffer more from things like cervical cancer and everything else. And so when you are looking at a problem that is so complex where systemic change is needed, you also have to simultaneously be bringing up the rear, so to speak, in order to make sure nobody gets left behind. So it's what you're doing as a balancing act, and you're also contributing an important part of the story, which might be the best way to serve, our underserved communities in the United States until we see some sort of systematic or systemic change that actually affords them the opportunity to have the full complement of birth options.
And wouldn't that be great? And where do you put your time and effort, and which hill are you gonna die on?
Yeah,
And, like,
yeah,
how
exactly.
exhausted can you be? And is all of this time and effort actually going to make the change? And I don't
Sure,
we don't have those
sure.
answers. I wanna talk about the systemic changes, though, because you work with people in fertility and having those beautiful births, and you've said a lot of things that mean to me it's my responsibility to take care of myself in the best way that I can so that I get my body and my mind. So it's like a spiritual, emotional, physical in the right place to support this home birth or this
Right.
pregnancy. And how does that feel or work for you? Because we live in a society of obesity, overeating, horrible food, constant medication.
Yeah,
I mean, no exercise, no sleep. You've talked about some of these things. So when a woman comes to you with fertility issues and there's obesity and high blood pressure, et cetera,
yeah,
all of these
yeah.
domino things, right? And the onus is really back on that person to get themselves healthy. How do you see that working? How has that been for you? I know people are
Yeah.
coming to you for that, but What's the resistance for you in that?
That's a great, very well worded question. So I actually get my biggest fan following from that messaging and my most detracting following from that sort of position. So the way that I view it is that 99% of doctors are accommodating chronic illness, right? They're not really
Right.
doing
Yes.
anything in order to spark any sort of systemic change. So what we say is, hey, you know, for fear of putting blame and shame on the individuals who are suffering from these conditions,
Right.
let's just not talk about that stuff. And let's just continue to accommodate without maybe perhaps acknowledging enough the fact that we are probably the richest nation and will be for a long time. And we spend about 5 times as much on our healthcare than even the second person in line. So without realizing that our resources are not actually going towards any sort of um, let's just say healthy policies or whatever, with regards to the masses in the United States. And that sort of undermining of the messaging that, hey, perhaps we can do better from a lifestyle standpoint. I think the intention there is great, right? The intention is, let's not put the onus entirely on the people. Let's just figure out a way to accommodate what that's happening while some other change happens. The problem is that there's no messaging towards the other change happening.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can say, hey, the United States is spending billions of dollars per year on fertility treatments, and the vast majority of those people probably don't need a $15,000 IVF, and many people can't afford a $15,000 IVF. What if instead of padding the pockets of the pharmaceutical companies and our REI clinics, the reproductive endocrinologists, what if instead of just padding that, what if somebody out there was actually talking about, hey guys, for a fraction of the price and through some systemic change, back to that conversation, and maybe an investment into prevention or reversal of chronic diseases that we know are prohibitive to conceiving naturally, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, those 3 things alone are going to make it very, very hard for you to get pregnant naturally. So if we were to instead say, listen, if we invested in those 3 things, which have remained some of the most expensive
Mm-hmm.
conditions to our healthcare system for at least 50 years, since World War II, basically, if we could say, why don't we invest equally into those buckets, then we maybe wouldn't be pushing people towards IVF as easily. And IVF is an independent risk factor for a variety of pregnancy complications. So regardless of what people want to say or do, the reality is that if we force your body to get pregnant and force your body to go to term, you're going to inevitably end up with pregnancy complications. This is not opinion. This is like very,
Right.
very, very much reflected in the literature. We're not doing anybody a favor. In fact, we're making their health worse by pumping them full of synthetic hormones. So on the short end, yes, everybody deserves to have a baby. In the long run, this is making our system even more corruptible and sort of on the brink of collapse as we realize that we can't continue to spend this amount of dollars on something as simple as getting a person pregnant when we haven't invested in the upstream causes of why their fertility challenges emerged in the first place. So again, there's a tension there, but I see myself as like, listen, if nobody's going to say it, I'm going to say it. Us
Mm-hmm.
OBGYNs need to do a better job of lifestyle counseling for that 7 minutes that you get with your client, which is a big part of the reason I left the system. For that 7 minutes, are you helping them dial in where their dollars are going every time they buy something? How are they able to exercise? Have you asked them, not just said you need to exercise more, but how many days per week can you exercise?
Right.
How can we utilize that time to the best of your ability? It could just be going up and down the stairs at work. It could be carrying your groceries to and from the car instead of a cart. It doesn't have to be you buy a $200 CrossFit membership. But
Right.
nobody is talking about it. Zero
That's my
people.
issue. Like, it just
Yeah,
drives me
like we still
nuts.
have to like acknowledge that if we're not taking care of people in their homes, in their home environment, we're just going to continue to slip down the slope of sicker and sicker people, causing greater and greater expenditures within our healthcare system and padding the pockets, unfortunately, not of many people, except for the pharmaceutical companies and these large hospital systems that are paying their CEOs
Right.
millions of dollars instead of investing in maybe a healthier cafeteria selection of food. The health cafeteria alone, Coke and Pepsi and Starbucks and all this stuff. So I kind of see myself as having to stand on top of the fence and yell at both sides and get hit with stones from both sides. And
Right.
That's where I guess I am.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of money in the pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of money to be made for insurance companies. And if they're driving things, then we're never going to get healthier. I have like three examples come to mind. There's a woman that I interviewed years ago who she's considered obese. She was in another country though, and they did not let her adopt because her weight was too high. In the US, we would
Wow.
like
Wow. That's
they
something.
they wanted her to have a healthier lifestyle before she was allowed to adopt children. Interesting, just interesting, right? My daughter 4 years ago, at 9 years old, was diagnosed with juvenile arthritis, and I asked the neurologist, or the rheumatologist, what could we do lifestyle wise? I felt like we were so healthy, and we were. And he said, the best thing you could do is take off your shoes and go live with a tribe in Africa. And I was like, dude, you do not have to ask me twice. I think that's a great idea. He's like, you just have to understand we live in a concrete jungle. We're surrounded by unhealthy lifestyle. And so it's
Yeah,
really a lifestyle. It's not an arthritis issue, it's a lifestyle issue. And you're just going to have to do things differently. And then a friend of mine in the military, a man who had a traumatic brain injury, ended up gaining weight, having seizures. I was running with him and asked him his story, and his doctor smartly said, I need you to walk for a minimum of 20 minutes a day, every single day. And that turned into a little bit more. He was off a dozen medications. He was no longer
that's it.
obese.
Yeah. And I've
Like,
seen the opposite happen. I've seen the opposite happen where a person moves to the city and they're not, or they move out of the city and they're driving every single day to and from work. And they
yeah,
suddenly in 10 years, they're on like 3 or 4 medications. I've
yeah.
seen the opposite happen. It's remarkable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is remarkable. I just think that there are really great situations that I have seen right here in my own town where, something significant happened in one direction or the other. And it's all about that lifestyle. And that is not where money is. You're right. The CrossFit gyms for $200 a month, that's where money
Yeah.
is. But
I
that's
mean,
not what
I can't even
changes.
afford that.
No, I
I don't
can't
afford
either.
a $200 gym, per month. So,
Right.
so, so getting back to the sort of tension, I think, around this
Yes, it's the
topic.
tension. Right.
Most of the time when I say something like that, it is taken as I'm holding up the mirror and showing people how they're to blame or they should be ashamed and this and that. I'm not doing that. However, we've also sort of um, kind of coddled the American mind in a way in such that nobody is going to be held responsible for anything. Even the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to be held responsible. Nobody wants to hold anybody accountable for this tremendous challenge we have here. But I recommend everybody go and check out Europe, check out Polynesia,
Hmm.
New Zealand, Australia, check out most of South America. They are not suffering in the way that we are, despite our immense amount of money from disease processes, you name the three, that are completely reversible. Now,
Hmm.
maybe not for everybody. 99% of the time, though, if we, instead of investing in pharmaceuticals and surgery, and instead, really decked ourselves out, deck the walls with nutritional support and exercise support and adequate sleep hygiene and stress management and adequate breathing practices and clean water and clean food and clean soil and all of that, we would not be here. But we should be embarrassed as a nation that we are suffering from these chronic conditions more so than most sub-Saharan African countries. Like they are
Yes.
not all diabetic and obese and hypertensive. So what's our excuse? Oh, it's blame and shame. It's not. It's just the reality, guys. Are we going to acknowledge that we're lost in the woods? Or are we just going
Hmm.
to keep wandering around without a map and a compass, just projecting more insecurities onto other people? So that's going to rattle somebody's cage. I'm willing to take it.
Uh,
That's what I've done my
Me
whole life.
too. I mean, what I call in the hospital is a cascade of interventions. The moment you walk in and have
Totally.
one intervention, your
Yeah.
chances of being at C-section, emergency C-section, from here to here, and it seems like a 0 to 60 thing, but it's not, because we watch that occur. The second you have one intervention, it's just a domino effect. And that's why are we one of the highest, we're a first world country that has highest infant mortality, maternal mortality, C-section rate. Why is that? Because we should be the healthiest nation. And so, I mean, I think the blame and shame needs to be pointed in all directions. But so that's a huge part of your practice. And somewhere in on your website, I read about the Dutch test, which is probably not familiar to a lot of people, but it's a different way to get testing really great results. So I've been
Sure.
hearing about it more. Can you talk about the testing that you do and then what you do with that information?
Yeah, so if a person comes to me and says that I used to have normal periods, now I don't have normal periods anymore, or they say maybe they were on birth control for a while,
Uh-huh.
um, there's two big tests that I generally run. If it's the birth control thing, or if they're on antidepressants or on taking a lot of NSAIDs like ibuprofen or acid blockers or whatever, I will generally, or if they have IBS symptoms, I'll generally do a stool analysis because
Mhm.
there's so much that happens in the gut that is relevant to our endocrine, nervous, and immune systems. Now, the Dutch test is usually, I usually reserve that for people who just tell me that their periods are off or whatever else. We usually start there. And then sometimes we add the stool analysis. So a Dutch test is a urine collection. You collect a specimen of urine on a stick and you put it into a collection container for an entire cycle and send it in. And what they do is they measure the various metabolites in the urine, which is basically just the breakdown products of hormones,
Mhm.
and they map it out basically over a period of time. And then they'll give you this rundown as to where you can actually look to see how are my adrenals functioning, how are my gonads functioning, and how are my breakdown processes, the metabolic pathways working in order to get rid of these metabolites. And so when you look at that, you, instead of just getting a one-time serum lab value, which doesn't really tell a story, it's just at that moment, here's what your estradiol was, your E2. Instead, you can actually look to see, okay, how is my body producing estradiol from an aromatization process from testosterone? How is my body producing estrone, another type of estrogen, and the interconversion between the two? How's my body producing estriol and the interconversion between estradiol and estriol? How is my liver working in order to break down estriol into the hydroxyestrones, some of which are actually very toxic and actually will contribute to breast cancer. So it lets you look at all of your methylation, your sulfation pathways, all of this stuff. And then we can actually start to apply a critical eye to figuring out what is it in your pantry that's maybe causing these results. How can we switch a couple of things out? Usually I'm never ordering more than $100 worth of additional stuff after that. And it's usually like a
Mhm.
6-week trial in order for us to try to get you back on track. And then once we get you back on track, then we can take a step back and consider, okay, these pathways are working well. Does this explain why maybe fertility is not working all that, going as smoothly as you would like? But the Dutch test is one of those elegant tests. It's not perfect. It sometimes isn't helpful, but usually it does give us something we can fine tune. Another really common complaint is, I don't have a libido anymore. I just feel like I don't have any lust for life. I've got poor motivation. We can actually look to see if your adrenals are working well. And the
Mhm.
adrenals and the gonads work very intimately together. So we can look to see, oh, you've got some metabolic dysfunction right at the mitochondria, or you've got some what's called adrenal fatigue in some circles, but it's really a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction. And that comes with parenting. Like when you're a new parent, you're not sleeping well, you're maybe grabbing snacks on the go, your adrenals take a hit. And so it also happens if you're under a lot of stress. So
Stress, yeah.
really, we first get a big clinical history, and then we try to apply what we see in the Dutch as a means of making sense as to why a person is feeling this way. And then we can start fine tuning things with some supplements. And then, of course, if we need to do some GI support, we can do that. But those are the two big tests that I do. I don't usually order like $1,000 worth of labs just willy nilly. If I
Right.
am starting somebody on hormone therapy, then I will order a big panel of labs just to make sure that we have a baseline. But I start with those two tests, and I can usually get to the bottom of most people's problems like that.
I just think that that's fascinating because they're really pretty easy tests to
Totally,
get
to
and to
collect, yeah.
take,
Hmm.
and, really not there's not a lot of intervention with them, and you're not you do it at home and send it in, and they're
Right, you're not
easy.
getting stuck with sharp needles. Yeah, and sometimes
Right.
the needles are helpful. Sometimes we do need
Yeah.
to follow up with some waking AM labs to see what your DHEAS or your testosterone
Mhm.
or whatever. But that's always after. It's always secondary. If it looks normal in the Dutch, I'm going to presume it looks normal on the needle stick. So yeah, there's still room for all that other stuff. I just oftentimes don't need it, which is great. People love
I
that.
I love that. I love that from a more holistic, point. I wanna switch gears a little bit because I know you help clients get pregnant and you want them to have the birth that they want, this autonomous birth. lead them to midwives, getting them getting them healthier overall. And I love that you said accepting responsibility for decisions and the
Yeah.
outcomes, because
Yeah.
that's super
Yeah.
important. I want to talk about that a little bit, like accepting responsibility. And I think if people are coming to you, they're already feeling stuck and they want a different way to do it that is healthier overall. Because it's not a pill that you're going to take, that you're not going to take Benadryl at night to help you sleep and then you're good to go.
Right. Right.
That's
Sedate yourself.
probably not. um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I want you to segue into the connecting intimately and strengthening the intimacy, especially as a dad supporting a woman through
Sure.
pregnancy, because that's different than me being pregnant and feeling
Yeah.
connecting
Yeah.
intimately. Can you talk about that part of your practice?
Yeah, it's actually become a bigger part of my practice than I ever intended. And I don't think I would have
Mhm.
been able to do it had I not been a father now twice, one hospital birth, one home birth. I've kind of got the bases covered there. And I find parenting very, very hard.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a one size fit all. I don't think that Kim John Payne has all of the answers, but seem to gravitate towards the soul of discipline and simplicity parenting. And then I have other people who read that book and they're like, this doesn't make a lick of sense for my kids. That's just the crapshoot that is parenting. Um, so I'll start by saying that, and then I'll furthermore say that when I was awaiting the arrival of our two babies, I didn't really have any modeling. I didn't really know what my job was, believe it or not. I knew. So a great example of how this played out was my wife said we were walking in the woods. She's like 7 months, 8 months pregnant, and we're just going on our hike and have our little dog with us. And she says, "What are you like? If you just like imagine what the experience is like when the contractions start or whatever, like like she was like, close your eyes and like really think about it." And I went through the sequence of events that happens when a baby comes. And she cut me off and she was like, no, 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 you're telling me the linear sequence of how things happen. She's like, I'm sure that will figure itself out. What are you feeling? And it like was an exercise that I hadn't even considered. Like, what is the smell? What is the like, is it dimly lit or bright lights? Do we have music playing? Do we have candles lit? Is there sage and Palo Santo burning? Like, what is the experience like for you? And I found myself feeling very insecure and sort of lacking confidence as to what my answer was. I was like, I don't know. I hadn't really, silly in me, I hadn't really thought about it. So one thing that I really like for the guys out there to really consider, or if you're, a pregnant woman and maybe you're going to be having a birth and your partner doesn't seem to have much modeling, I
Yeah.
would really consider you to start with that exercise and to really kind of hone in, what does that feel like to you? Like dream it up. Like what is that whole environment like? And most people are not going to come up with, by the way, the hospital scenario. So again, we're not talking about the entire population. Let's assume you have $1 billion and you can have a birth of your dreams wherever you want it to be, at the top of a mountain amongst the bald eagles, like whatever. What is that dream space look like? And you as the guy have probably been conditioned to believe that there's a job for you and that job is going to entail fixing a problem. Well, I got
Ah,
news for you. The good news is there's not a problem to fix. The bad news is there's not a problem to fix. And that's how you've been validated and valued maybe your entire life as a young man. So in our Born Free Method program that Sara Rosser and I created, we have a whole unit just for the dads where we talk about sacred polarities, divine masculine, divine feminine. What is the role of a real man in childbirth? And sometimes the answer to that is you do nothing. You practice bearing witness and holding space for this person who's bringing your baby earthside. But even beyond that, the moment of the birth, the best piece of advice I've ever been given is forget about the moment of the birth. That part's actually pretty easy. I mean, it's tremendously hard in the moment. But what's way harder that you don't even realize because you haven't prepared for it is the 18 years thereafter that you have to raise
mm,
this child. And your
mm,
partnership has to have some sort of congruity in order for you guys to stay intimately connected, for your relationship to survive, for your communication to be dialed in. All of that is stuff you can work on all the way up until the baby comes. Because when the baby comes, you're now going to be in like survival mode, and your relationship oftentimes ends up kind of on the rocks for periods of time. So
right.
if you do all this hard work ahead of time, you're going to be very well prepared for that moment after the birth, and it actually is also going to serve you in the birth itself.
I agree. I work with the dads more than the moms. I mean, it's the mom that hires me as her doula. But when I show up, I'm like, most of the work is the dad. The
Yeah.
the woman's body is going to take over, and this is going to happen, and in the end, regardless of the situation, a baby will be born. You will not be
Yeah.
pregnant. There's never a case of a woman who's pregnant forever, but that's not, you're right, that's not the biggest issue. Tell me about, you touched on it a little bit, the born free method, and you've got that on your Zoom
Yeah.
thing. And you mentioned it just now. That was my next question. I want you to talk about, you're releasing that course, or was it already released?
Yeah, so it's a program. It incorporates a course, a self-guided online e-learning course, which is over 100 video modules on every intervention under the sun, on all the lifestyle stuff, on radical responsibility, on birth planning, unit for dads, unit on cannabis, psychedelics. Like it's everything you've ever wanted to know, including stuff people don't like talking about: vaccines, ultrasound, vitamin K, ROGAM, antibiotics, all of this stuff. That's included. But really, what this is a 12-month coaching program where you meet with me and Sara every week. There's 2 calls per week at different times and days so that you're never missing it. The calls are recorded. We've got this big video library growing from our past calls. We bring in guest speakers. Really, this is an opportunity for you to work with me and Sara one-on-one, but in a
Mm,
group coaching setting. So, this is the only program out there, which it launched in May, but we're doing our
okay.
last enrollment in September. So people can go to bornfreemethod.com to jump on an enrollment call. We'll get you in that day. And it's not like any other program out there because we're meeting with you every single week for 12 months. You've got the most comprehensive e-learning program available, and you're getting worksheets, checklists, guided meditations. We spent $25,000 building the program
Mhm.
because we wanted to put the best thing out there, and we weren't finding anything that was even close to what we do in our daily lives as experienced birth workers, as people who look at all the data, and also balance that data with a truly spiritual appreciation for what this transformative period is for a couple. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a tremendous outpouring of hell yeses from the people that are there, including birth
Mhm.
workers who are taking it to extend their education. They've told us this is way more comprehensive than what we learned in doula training and
Oh,
midwifery
yeah.
training. Like this is awesome. So it is my magnum opus. Something I'm very, very proud of.
I am proud of you for this. And I also want to talk about how proud I am that you went through all of the medical training and all of that, but then you stayed true to who you were and you found a balance within that somewhere. You also have a podcast. All of your links are in our show notes. And it has been an absolute privilege, Nathan, to hang out with you and chat. Thank you so much.
The privilege is mine, and I want to shout out to all the people out there that are listening. If you're listening to you can only get a couple hours per week of listening to podcasts if you're like me. And if
Hmm.
you're choosing to listen to a show like this, you're on the right path. Just spread the
Yeah.
word and continue just to like consider. You talked about radical responsibility. If you want to
Hmm.
have real freedom, you have to be willing to honor the outcomes of your decisions as well. That means I can't tell you what's right or wrong. You can tell you and your family, you can do what's right for them. And that requires us to be educated, informed, empowered, and supported, by the people out there who, like me and you, who've dedicated ourselves to caring for people. So keep fighting the good fight, everybody, if you're listening. And I always feel it's a privilege to be brought into somebody else's platform. So thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.